Welcome back to the Emily Show. Yes, still a bit under the weather. Some of you will be able to hear it for sure. And I feel like, I don't know if we're calling this the Emily Show or like, what did he do now? Because now we have a bunch more filings and the court setting a hearing very shortly. So I am recording on Monday, November 18th. There were a fleet of filings today. The court set a hearing for Tuesday, November 19th. So we might have an addendum in the description if the court rules, but the court has decided there needs to be a hearing. There are a ton of different matters pending and a hearing also set on November 22nd. The government is accusing Sean Diddy Combs of continuing to reach out to witnesses, to persist in witness intimidation, to be flouting the rules of federal detention, and the defense is accusing the prosecution of searching the defendant's cell for attorney-client privileged information. If you're like, Emily, we've heard this before. Yes, in the Corey Richins case, but it's different here. So we're going to get into all of that today because this case has a massive amount of litigation and it's just not going to stop. Welcome to the Emily Show. I'm Emily D. Baker, the internet's go-to legal analyst and big fan of the cursey words. I've been a licensed attorney for over 17 years. I'm a former prosecutor, and I break down the legal side of pop culture and entertainment stories we can't stop talking about. We should just get into it. Let's go. Thank you to today's sponsor, Green Chef. It feels like there is so much to do this time of year, and a lot of those events revolve around cooking. But if you want to take up some of the lift, you can bring in Green Chef. Not only is Green Chef the #1 meal kit for clean eating because they deliver organic, pre-portioned and prepped quality foods right to your door, but you also get fresh produce, sourced proteins, and chef-designed recipes, and that includes tastes of the season, including holiday meals. So if you are ready to take some of the shopping out of everything you have to do this time of year, now is the time to check out Green Chef. They will even deliver an organic turkey right to your door, like the full thing. And if you just need breakfast taken off of your plate, you can also add in things like the egg bites or ready to blend smoothies made with the freshest ingredients. So whether you are ready to simplify all your meals or just simplify Thanksgiving and have it delivered right to your door, Green Chef has you covered. Right now, you can head to greenchef.com/EmilyBaker50 for 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next 2 months. That's 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next 2 months. Use code EmilyBaker50 at greenchef.com. Thank you, Green Chef, for sponsoring today's episode and all of my dinners for like the last 2 years. Let's get back to it. So first, I think it's helpful if we go over what legally is going on in the Diddy federal prosecution. There are a number of motions still pending. As to some of them, the government has done a combined response. I've covered that response on QuickBits. And for those of you on YouTube, that's on the QuickBits channel. For those of you in audio, it's on the same audio feed on your favorite podcasting app. For those of you that had the app, it's just in the app. We're going to have to do a combined playlist of all of the Diddy between all of the coverage. But here's generally what's pending before all the filings dropped on Monday, the 18th. And that was 3 particular defense motions. A defense motion regarding leaks. The government's been calling that the leak motion, where the defense is saying that the government leaked grand jury material to the public and how dare they. The second motion is for a bill of particulars, or tell us everything more specifically. And the government's like, we did that in the detention hearing. And if you want my coverage of the detention hearing, I will list it because I went to that initial detention hearing and gave you a breakdown. The government laid out their case in quite a lot of detail, but we do know that this investigation is ongoing, so that can change. There is also a gag order motion where the defense is asking for an order prohibiting extrajudicial statements from basically everybody, and the defense just recently replied to that as well. So there are quite a lot of motions pending. There is also now the defense's new motion for bail. I went over that. And now the government's opposition to the motion for bail, which was filed on Friday, November 15th. And then On Monday, that fleet of filings where the defense is accusing the prosecution of raiding the defendant's jail cell and taking attorney-client privileged information. And the prosecution is saying, no, that's not the circumstances here. Let me give you a fuller picture. But we're going to go through the government's opposition to the bail motion first. The government has put in a lot more information about what they are alleging to be witness intimidation, the defendant's behavior while in custody in the MDC, and more. And that motion is referenced heavily in the government's response to the defendant's newest motions with regard to whether or not the prosecution has attorney-client privileged information between defendant and his lawyers. So with all of it, let's just get into the motions. We're just covering all of the motions today. So first up is the government's opposition to the defendant's renewed motion for bail. This was filed on Friday, November 15th, as I mentioned, and we're going to go through that hopefully pretty quickly. First up, the government's preliminary statement is that the government submits its opposition to the defendant's renewed motion for bail. The defendant's motion should be denied. As two judges have already concluded based on the evidence and record, the defendant poses a serious risk of danger and obstruction of the proceedings. In seeking a new hearing, the defendant rehashes the same arguments rejected by those two judges with claims of new evidence. As I talked about both in Quick Bits and in live streams discussing the Corey Richins case, there has to be grounds for bail to be reconsidered. A change of circumstances, new evidence, but something has to change. It can't just be like, excuse me, Your Honor, can we just ask again for the same thing that you've already denied? There has to be a reason to ask again. And the government in a lot of this motion says the defendant is doing nothing new but rehashing their facts again and again and again. What the government didn't say is, Carrie Morrissey, what? No, because a lot of those motions in the New Mexico cases had a lot of rehashing of the facts ad nauseum. So the prosecution here is saying this is just a extended rehashing of the facts. It goes on to say the defendant offers nothing new and material justifying a third bail hearing. In fact, the only truly, quote, new relevant evidence shows that the defendant has continued to engage in a relentless course of obstructive conduct designed to subvert the integrity of these proceedings. As described in detail below, while attempting to evade law enforcement monitoring, the defendant has, among other things, orchestrated social media campaigns that are, in his own words, aimed at tainting the jury pool, made efforts to publicly leak materials he views as helpful to his case, and contacted witnesses through third parties. For these reasons, the court should deny a new bail hearing. Well, let's see what tea the government has on this, shall we? Because we know that they've already mentioned the Sam Bankman-Fried case. In that case, the large crypto disaster that was FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried, or SBF, was accused of leaking unflattering information material to the government's key witness to the New York Times while he was on home detention rather than bail. His bail was revoked and he was put in custody for that. So even though there were quite a lot of restrictions on him in his bail, they were not enough to keep him from endeavoring, they say, to embarrass the government's key witness. He was still convicted and sentenced. The key witness also still sentenced subsequent to a plea deal. But I digress. Back to this motion, the government says, in light of the well-documented danger posed by the defendant, the updated proposed conditions of release are woefully insufficient to assure the safety of the community and integrity of the proceedings. The defendant's request for temporary release should similarly be denied. The defendant's confinement in the MDC, or Metropolitan Detention Center, Brooklyn, affords him more than adequate opportunity to prepare for trial, and his convenience does not provide a basis to reevaluate the danger to the community and the threat to the integrity of the proceedings that the defendant's release poses. They then go on to say that after nearly a year-long investigation, so now we know a little bit more about how long the investigation was ongoing. We know that Sean Combs knew that this was happening for quite a while ahead of his arrest, but now we know that the investigation was over a year before the arrest. They say that defendant Combs ensured that female victims participated in freak-offs through coercion and violence, including by supplying them with controlled substances, subjecting them to physical, emotional, and verbal abuse, controlling their careers, livelihoods, and housing, and threatening to disseminate recordings of the freak-offs. In connection with this conduct, count 2 charges the defendant with sex trafficking of victim 1 by force, fraud, and coercion. It goes on to talk about the defendant's remand and says that the indictment was released on September 17th. And because the defendant was charged with sex trafficking, detention is presumed under the Bail Reform Act, which means when you are charged with this particular crime, it's presumed that you stay in custody. And the defense then has to rebut that presumption to show that this particular defendant or any particular defendant should not stay in detention. But it puts the onus on the defense to rebut that presumption of detention. The prosecution then rehashes the two bail hearings, one on September 17th that I attended, one on September 18th, which was a second bail hearing immediately after the first. And they said in that hearing, Judge Carter denied the defendant bail and stated that the government had, quote, proven that the defendant is a danger regarding obstruction of justice and witness tampering by clear and convincing evidence, and that the defendant is a danger to the safety of others in the community more generally by clear and convincing evidence. The government goes on to say that the defendant asserts the court should consider, quote, new information relating to the defendant's relationship with victim one and his communications with various witnesses as a basis to reopen the bail hearing. But they say that all of those quote unquote new facts are the exact same arguments the defense has made in multiple bail hearings now, and there is nothing in fact new. It goes on to say that defendants rehashing the same personal attacks he made against victim one before Judge Carter is not new information. Those are the government's exact words. They go on to say that the defendant claims communications between defendant and victim one, which were recently produced in discovery as part of the defendant's electronic devices and accounts, constitute new material. The defendant claims that the recently produced text messages reveal, quote, a loving, at times toxic long-term relationship between two adults who decided mutually to break up. That is from the defendant's motion. The government says this claim is nothing new, and defense counsel has made these exact points previously and even referred to text message communications. And then they cite the argument made at the September 17th hearing that I talked about when I broke that hearing down, where again, the defense strategy seems to be just continue to attack and undermine victim one. The quote from that hearing of the defense's arguments before the judge is stated by the government here saying this is a 10-year relationship. This sex trafficking is a 10-year relationship. These two people were in love. That will be made abundantly clear by the way they speak to each other, by the way other witnesses described their time together, by the circumstances of how they broke up. They were in love, but Mr. Combs wasn't always faithful. At the end of the day, there was mutual philandering, and victim one ended up marrying the trainer that Mr. Combs got for her and had two children. That signaled the end of the relationship. That is how Combs's lawyers are framing the relationship here. The government goes on to say, furthermore, in presenting recently produced text message, the defendant cherry picks to paint a misleading picture, ignoring numerous other messages in record between defendant and victim one, documenting the defendant's physical abuse of victim one and his threats to expose recordings of the freak-offs. Right, that would go to that coercion that the sex trafficking count goes to. And then they quote various text messages. The government says, text message reading, quote, you know what sick and disgusting shit I was reminded of the other day? Question mark. You forcing me to redacted, or you are going to leak some freak off shit. I have a black eye and a fat lip. You are sick for thinking it's okay to do what you've done. I still have crazy bruising. I turn my head for a second and you get fucked up and you drag me down the hall by my hair. I have bleeding cuts. You hit me in the head 2 good times. Quote, when you get fucked up the wrong way, you always want to show me that you have power and you knock me around. I'm not a rag doll. I'm someone's child. So those are just an example of the text messages left out during the same time period, the prosecution says, by the defense. The prosecution goes on to say, moreover, despite attaching lengthy text messages between the defendant and victim one on various dates between August and November 18th, the defendant omits messages produced in the same thread about defendant's violence. And then there are redacted portions of this motion, just like a lot of that was redacted out of the defense motion. They say that defendant also rehashes his attacks on victims one's motive to bring the civil lawsuit. And then astutely, I think, says the defendant has made clear that his litigation strategy is to personally attack victim one, stooping to any depth to attempt to undermine her credibility. Seems to be. You let me know what you think. Don't disagree with the government on that. It goes on to say that the court should reject the defendant's request to reopen the bail hearing because the defendant disagrees with the government's use of the term victim. And this is regarding a separate victim that is referred to in the charging documents, but not attached to a specific count. And that is talking about victim 2. It goes on to reference that victim 2 is an individual to whom the defendant continues to pay a significant monthly sum. And there's a footnote there saying that bank records show defendant's payments to victim 2 as recently as mid-September 2024. The government has requested and is awaiting updated financial documents through the present. It goes on to say whether or not the defendant agrees with the characterization of victim 2 as a victim for purposes of this case. The communications highlighted by the government indicate that the defendant used financial coercion to attempt to feed victim 2 a narrative that consisted with the defense's theory. And then we start getting into alleged contact with witnesses. The motion says that the defendant's contacts with witnesses demonstrates that he poses a threat to the integrity of the proceedings, and then lines them out. Witness 1. It says the defendant's attempts to spin his contacts with witnesses, including witnesses served with grand jury subpoenas, as evidence rebutting the government's proof of obstruction, fail in their entirety. It says defendant claims the government misled the court and concealed the actual content of the communication between the defendant and a witness who was served with a grand jury subpoena in June 2024. The government took that as an open door to spill all of the tea. The motion goes on to say, as an initial matter, the nature and substance of the defendant's communications with witness 1 was known to the defendant at the time of the initial hearing. But more importantly, these contacts, including the fact that the defendant evidently deleted messages from his phone, confirm the government's proffer at the initial hearing and refute statements made by the defense. Why is that important? Well, when the government gets all of the phone records, they're going to not only have the physical download from the defendant's phone, they're going to have the phone records from the carrier, and then they're going to have the phone records from the other end of the conversation, whomever's phone that is. And if the messages are deleted off of the defendant's phone, but they still show up on phone records and they still show up on the other person's phone record, it goes to show oftentimes that the defendant is deleting those particular text messages. So the government is also putting in more information than we've seen in this case through this motion. They go on to say phone records show that between the end of 2022 and January 2024, Witness 1 occasionally contacted defendant by phone without any response from defendant. That changed in June 2024. Witness 1 was served with a grand jury subpoena on June 19th, and after contacting the government was appointed counsel on June 25th, which is an interesting tidbit. It says beginning on June 26th, only after Witness 1 had been served with a grand jury subpoena and had counsel, the defendant initiated contact with Witness 1. Isn't that timing interesting? It goes on to say the defendant attempted to obscure that contact initially by calling Witness 1's wife and later communicating with Witness 1 over a VoIP service or a voice over IP service, including by text and a call lasting over 7 minutes. The following day, phone records indicate that Witness 1 spoke with counsel for the defendant. Even though Witness 1 was represented by counsel, he and the defendant continued to directly exchange text messages, and defense counsel also spoke with Witness 1 again on July 8th. Following Witness 1's testimony to the grand jury on July 25th, the defendant called and texted Witness 1 again. It goes on to say the defendant's repeated contact with Witness 1, despite his apparent knowledge that Witness 1 was represented by counsel and had received a grand jury subpoena, undermines defense counsel's previous denials of the defendant's interference in the government's grand jury investigation and shows that counsel cannot stop defendant from contacting grand jury witnesses. And then footnote 3 says, as a transcript from September 18th, they directly quote defense counsel saying he did not reach out to grand jury witnesses. I dispute that wholeheartedly. He didn't do it, and he wouldn't do it. And he wouldn't do it because he has the sense not to do it. And he wouldn't do it because we wouldn't let him do it, you know? Apparently the government's like, no, I don't know, because they put it in a footnote and they attached the transcript. The government goes on to say this concern is amplified by evidence indicating that the defendant appears to have deleted his messages with Witness 1. Although the phone records confirm that the defendant using a particular phone number and that Witness 1 exchanged multiple text messages from June to August, there were no such messages recovered from defendant's cell phone associated with that number. They then go on to Witness 2. Defendant also claims that the defendant's contacts in September 2024 with an individual represented by counsel who wanted to make a public statement, witness 2, were not in any way obstructive because defendant and witness 2 were previously in frequent contact. The government goes on to say, however, the contact between defendant and witness 2, who were bandmates, stopped in March 2024. I don't know if they were bandmates or if maybe witness 2 was in a band that defendant put together. You let me know. And from the timeline and context of the defendant's contacts with witness 2, it's clear that when defendant reinitiated contact with witness 2 in September 2024, his purpose was to ensure witness 2 was on his side and pressure witness 2 to make a public statement denying allegations of violence by the defendant. Defendant reached out to witness 2 on September 11th, 2024, and sent her a copy of the lawsuit against the defendant in which witness 2's name is mentioned several times. The defendant then called witness 2 and they spoke for nearly 6 minutes. After reading the lawsuit, witness 2 called the defendant back at his request and they spoke for over 4 minutes. Evidently, the defendant and witness 2 discussed witness 2's drafting a statement, as immediately after the call, the defendant told witness 2 in a text message, and then it's redacted. Damn it. It then said the defendant asked for witness 2's attorney's name. From September 11th, 2024 to September 15th, 2024, defendant and witness 2 exchanged multiple text messages and phone calls, at least 128 phone contacts in total in 4 days. Throughout these phone contacts, the defendant repeatedly asked witness 2 when she planned to post her statement. Witness 2 ultimately made a statement about the lawsuit via Instagram on September 13th. Then, after the defendant was in custody, BOP, which is Bureau of Prisons, investigators recovered the following notes from the defendant's cell during a pre-planned nationwide sweep of Bureau of Prisons facilities. And that's footnote 4. And this is where we get into the new motions. Footnote 4 says, with respect to materials, oh, I am sick. I can't even do the footnote voice. Let me try. With respect to materials received from the Bureau of Prisons that included possibly privileged materials, such as notes recovered from the defendant's cell, the prosecution team only accessed those materials after they had been reviewed by the filter team. Oh, the feds don't call it a taint team. Well, that's so disappointing. It goes on to cite a case talking about the potential options, including government filter team for review of potentially privileged search warrant materials. So the government denotes that materials were taken from defendant. They denote that materials recovered from the Bureau of Prisons that could possibly have privileged materials went to a filter team. Bring back taint team. This is not the case. Emily, this is not the case to talk about a taint team. They then redact the pre-planned sweep of Bureau of Prisons facilities. It says the strong inference to be drawn from the defendant's communications with witness 2 and his personal notes is that the defendant paid witness 2 after she posted the statement. So whatever's redacted out seems to go to what was recovered from Sean Combs' cell, and whatever was recovered seems to indicate that the defendant, through a third party, because he's not initiating that from jail, paid the witness who posted the Instagram statement. The government goes on to say, from the timeline, the context, and the context of the communications between defendant and witness 2, the defendant's clear goal was for witness 2 to draft and post a statement. Even after the defendant knew witness 2 had counsel, he continued to reach out to her directly, a fact that clearly concerned Judge Carter, and rightfully so. They then go on to argue that just because it's inconvenient for a defendant to be in custody doesn't mean it's a reason for him to be released from custody, saying that the defendant cannot adequately prepare for his defense at MDC is not supported by the law, and he has been afforded reasonable opportunity for private communication with counsel, which is what the law requires. They go on to say that MDC has provided defendant with more than reasonable accommodations to meet with counsel. The defendant is permitted to meet with counsel 7 days a week and regularly has access to a separate conference room off of the common area of his unit. Records indicate that the defendant has met with counsel daily most days since he has been in custody. Records also indicate that the defendant frequently communicates with his attorneys by telephone and written communication, including, as explained below, through unauthorized means. But even if the defendant were only using authorized channels of communications, the MDC's procedures do not infringe on defendant's constitutional right to effective counsel or to participate in his own defense. We talked about this in the Corey Richins case too. There are authorized means for attorneys and clients to communicate so that they are logged that a call happened, but they're not recorded, the contents of which are not known, and they are kept more private. But it's known when somebody comes in or out of the jail, and it's known when calls are made on that private attorney line, or as they are saying, through unauthorized means, and we'll get to that next. Thank you to today's sponsor, Honeylove. Look, 'tis the season to be comfortable, and can you ever be truly comfy cozy if your bras are uncomfortable? No, not really. What is the use of a fantastic outfit if you are constantly pulling at your shapewear, right? It kind of ruins the vibe, and that's where Honeylove has you covered, literally and figuratively. So whether you are looking for the best shapewear in the market that isn't going to roll down or shift on you after you've put it on under your favorite outfit, or if you're just looking for a bra that's going to reduce the tugging and pulling and back bulge so that you look sleek and smooth in your favorite sweaters, it's time to check out Honeylove. And while you're there, you might as well check out my favorite sleepwear because it is truly fantastic and I wear it all year round. So if you are ready to give yourself the gift of comfort, for November only, Honeylove is offering up to 50% off site-wide. That's right, up to 50% off site-wide. So head to honeylove.com/lawnerd to get this deal for this month only. Inventory is limited and the sale ends soon, so don't miss the best deals of the season. And after you purchase the last how you heard about them, please share that you heard about Honeylove on The Emily Show. So elevate your comfort, elevate your style. Thanks to Honeylove. Let's get back to today's episode. The government then goes on to say that the defendant's complaints about conditions at MDC come as a surprise to the government, given the contrary public statements made by defense counsel and statements made by the defendant in monitored calls. Footnote 6 is an article with People magazine that says, Sean Diddy Combs' attorney says food's probably the roughest part of the mogul's life in prison. So again, they are using his words against him. They then get into their argument that the defendant is a risk because he continues to obstruct justice. And there's even a footnote on the heading of this section. The footnote says, quote, since the defendant's arrest, the government has continued investigating the defendant's obstructive conduct and began receiving recordings of the defendant BOP calls, Bureau of Prisons, in October 2024. These calls in their entirety will be produced to the defendant through a filter team prior to the bail hearing scheduled for November 22nd. The government did not previously disclose these recordings due to its ongoing investigation, but is doing so now given the recent escalation in defendant's efforts to influence the jury pool in this criminal case, set out in detail below. Dun, dun, dun. They say that since defendant has been detained at MDC, he has continued to try to evade law enforcement monitoring, corruptly influence witness testimony, and further attack the integrity of the proceedings. Specifically, they say while in custody, the defendant has repeatedly communicated with others in a way that violate BOP rules and are designed to evade BOP and law enforcement monitoring, including as described below, using PAC numbers belonging to other inmates to make calls, using three-way calls to contact other individuals, including individuals who are not on his approved contact list, and using an unauthorized third-party communication system to send messages to numerous individuals, including unauthorized contacts. Yes, everything is monitored when you're in custody. Yes, using other inmate numbers is common. This is something we saw Alec Murdaugh doing, who's trading beef sticks. Later, the government says that Diddy is having people put money on their books so he can keep using their numbers. This is a violation of the rules. This happens in just about every custody case I think I've ever seen. It's rarely, I think, successful because there are other ways to track phone calls than just through PAC numbers, but it is regularly also used against defendants saying, see, Your Honor, if they can't even follow the rules in custody, what's to say they're going to follow the rules when they're not in custody? You, Your Honor, can put all the rules you want in the world. You can do anything you want, but if he's already breaking the rules to have contact with people he shouldn't have contact with, then why should you let him out where he has even more freedom to make the type of contact that is not authorized? So the defense brought in a bail motion saying, we'll have 24/7 monitoring and he'll have a very narrow list of approved contacts. Well, he has a list of approved contacts now and he's not sticking to it. Why would he stick to it when he's not in custody? I think that argument's probably going to be persuasive. if the judge even finds that the defense has met their burden to allow this hearing to go forward. The judge might allow the hearing to go forward just to say no, he's continuing to do all of this. It goes on to talk about other inmates' PAC numbers or PAC numbers. The government has reviewed dozens of recordings of BOP jail calls in which the defendant uses telephone accounts of at least 8 other inmates. I wonder if any of them are Sam Bankman-Fried, which is against BOP regulations, seemingly to avoid law enforcement monitoring. That's always why it's done. It's always done to avoid law enforcement monitoring. It goes on to say the defendant uses other inmates' PAC numbers to make phone calls to both individuals on the defendant's approved contact list, as well as other individuals who are not on the approved contact list. To obtain or maintain access to other inmates' PAC numbers, defendant directs others to pay the inmates, including through payment processing apps and the BOP commissary account deposits. The defendant knows this is against BOP regulations, and at the outset of each telephone call, the inmate is prompted to enter his PAC number, after which an automated recording announces sharing of PAC numbers is against BOP policy and is subject to disciplinary action. 3-way calling. It also says the defendant frequently instructs individuals whom he contacts by telephone, including family members and his attorneys, to add other individuals via 3-way calling. This is not unique, new, or different, but this happens a lot. It's also against the rules. This practice is also not authorized by BOP as it helps conceal the identities of contacted individuals. The government has reviewed multiple calls in which defendant instructs others to dial third parties, including members and associates of the enterprise and individuals who are not on the contact list. When they say the enterprise, there is a RICO charge here. So they're talking about the RICO enterprise. So potential co-defendants. It then goes on to get into non-authorized messaging services, which I'm wondering if the government will at some point try to shut this down, but it seems that there is a messaging service called Contact Me ASAP that allows federal inmates to try to communicate with loved ones through real-time messages to maybe end run the communications here and to, they say, obscure communications. And they talk about how he set up emails through that. It goes on to say even more concerning is the defendant's use of these unauthorized methods of communications to continue his effort to obstruct and subvert this criminal proceeding. The defendant's intentions are reflected in his own words on BOP calls with a network of family members and associates whom the defendant is tasking with executing his will. On multiple calls, often using the PAC numbers of others, the defendant is explicit about his intention to use public statements to alter public perception. This is my shocked face. The defendant leaves no doubt that the narrative he wants to blank is the potential jury pool's perception of this criminal proceeding. Why is that redacted? The narrative he wants to put forward, alter, tell me what you think is redacted out of there. What word did they redact? The defendant leaves no doubt that the narrative he wants to redact is the potential jury pool's perception of this proceeding. Examples of this are plentiful, yet they're all redacted. And the transcripts of all these calls are attached to this motion, and they're redacted too. It goes on to say, notably, the defendant continued these efforts after the court's October 24th order, requested by the defense. That was my italices voice. I don't know. I don't feel well. It says prohibiting exactly this sort of conduct. After the court entered the order, the defendant enlisted family members to plan and execute a social media campaign around the defendant's birthday. Did any of you see that on social? With the intention of influencing the potential jury pool in this criminal proceeding. At the defendant's carefully curated direction, the defendant's children posted a video to their respective social media accounts showing the defendant's children gathering to celebrate the defendant's birthday. The defendant from within the MDC then monitored the analytics, i.e. audience engagement, and explicitly discussed with his family how to ensure that the video had the desired effect on potential jury members in this case. Redacted, phone call transcripts. It said, besides flagrantly violating the court's October 25th order prohibiting this kind of interference with the jury trial, the defendant's own words make clear his intent is to improperly influence the jury pool in this criminal proceeding. The defendant does not stop there. During the calls, the defendant makes clear his intention to anonymously publish information that he thinks will help the defense in this case. So who's leaking shit? Who's leaking shit? You know, the defense might protest too much when they're like, the government leaked this, the government leaked that. Well, who's leaking stuff? Or at least who's planning to leak stuff? Well, now the public's on notice that this is part of the plan, except then the rest of the statements of the calls are redacted. The motion goes on to say the defendant's efforts to anonymously leak video favorable to his defense in this case show that he is using his so-called public relations strategy to influence this criminal case. They go on to allege that the defendant's efforts to obstruct the integrity of the proceedings also includes relentless efforts to contact potential witnesses, including victims of his abuse, who could provide powerful testimony against him. For example, on October 4th, in a call involving the defendant and one of his adult sons, defendant says, redacted. And then after all of the redacted, it says, provides the clear inference that the defendant's goal is to blackmail victims and witnesses, either into silence or providing testimony helpful to the case. They go on to talk about the defendant being a danger, and they talk about not only the fact that he has engaged in violence, including kidnapping and arson, but they talk about the intimidation, leaking photos, videos, etc. They go on to argue that the defendant's new proposed bail package is insufficient in the face of the significant evidence that the defendant poses a risk of obstruction, a danger to the community, a risk of non-appearance, and given all of that, the updated proposal is, quote, woefully insufficient. They also say that the defendant's emphasis on 24/7 private security is problematic. The defendant has demonstrated an uncanny ability to get others to do his bidding. Employees, family members, and MDC inmates alike. There is no reason to believe that private security personnel would be immune. I mean, CEG Fat Leonard. I covered that case a while ago. For those of you that are like, who, what? It's a whole thing involving the U.S. Navy. It goes on to say, at any rate, the defendant's private jail proposal, quote, at best elaborately replicates a detention facility without the confidence of security such a facility instills. Moreover, the Second Circuit has expressly decried attempts like the defendant's to pay his way out of detention. They say the defendant's updated proposal simply does not alleviate the risk of danger, obstruction, and flight, particularly in light of the defendant's inability to comply with BOP regulations and his efforts to engage in obstructive conduct even while subject to monitoring at MDC. So that is 25 pages of the government's over 100 pages of filings. The rest of that is transcripts and, you guessed it, redacted. This bail hearing is set on calendar for November 22nd. I will be stunned if bail is not summarily denied again. I wonder if the judge will have some strong words about the seemingly evasive conduct in MDC and using other inmates' numbers. But the defense has some strong words, and that's going to hearing, well, before this episode airs. And filed on November 18th is a letter from defense attorneys to the judge. Defense counsel has recently learned that prosecutors are in possession of attorney-client privilege material, including the defendant's own written notes. This search and seizure are in violation of Combs' Fifth, Fourth, and Sixth Amendment rights. Moreover, the targeted seizure of a pretrial detainee's work product and privileged materials created in preparation for trial is outrageous government conduct amounting to a substantive due process violation. Because the prosecutors are currently in possession of privileged material and are actively using this material to detain the defendant, the defense requests an immediate evidentiary hearing. This is an emergent matter because the government has Mr. Combs' privileged notes to his lawyers concerning defense witnesses and defense strategies. Defendants coming in hot. This all seems to come from the footnote in the last motion. The last motion that was filed Friday, this was filed Monday. I imagine between Friday and Monday, they went and talked to Sean Combs and asked what was taken. We'll learn more about exactly what that is in the government's motion. I think it might be overstated here by the defense. But again, this defense team has repeatedly overstated things. I normally wouldn't assume that anything's overstated. I would be like, oh my God, they can't do that. But so much in this case to this point, and we're 2 months in, has been overstated by the defense. The downplaying of the video from the Intercontinental, I find myself taking most things written with I want to see what the response is to that. And so that's where I'm coming at this motion too. Just from the history in this case, I want to see what the prosecution's response is. And we'll see that next. It goes on to say the government's opposition to defendant's bail motion states that the trial prosecutors are currently in possession of, quote, possibly privileged materials such as notes recovered from the defendant's cell, docket 69 at 12, footnote 4. That's not what the footnote says. I just read it. We just went over that. That's not what the footnote says. The footnote says, to the extent there is any possibly privileged information, it was run through a filter team. It goes on to say, in fact, the government is in possession of written material that is absolutely privileged. This is a matter of grave concern that, most respectfully, must be addressed immediately for the following reasons. First, there is no dispute that the government is in possession of privileged material. Second, until receiving the government's submission at 11:29 p.m. on Friday, November 15th, the defense had never been told that, one, Mr. Combs' notes were taken from his cell. Well, if you're talking to him daily, why didn't he tell you that? Did he not know? Or were they not taken? If you're talking to your client daily and this happened in October, then why didn't you know? It says 2, that the notes were given to the U.S. Attorney's Office. 3, that the notes were then given to the trial prosecutors in the case, who then used this material in a filing to keep Combs detained. They did use information that they learned in a filing to say that they thought that witness 2's Instagram post was paid for. They 100% did. But is that privileged? It goes on to say, we request an immediate hearing at which the government shall provide answers to the following questions. Ooh, we're going to tell you how it is. First, who authorized a search of Mr. Combs' sleeping area, personal effects, and paperwork? I mean, he's in custody. Second, who determined what paperwork to take? Third, who decided to give this paperwork to the United States Attorney's Office? Fourth, who decided to give this paperwork to trial prosecutors? Fifth, who made the decision not to tell Mr. Combs' counsel that the U.S. Attorney was in possession of his notes, including, quote, possibly privileged materials, until after the government put them in a filing to keep him incarcerated? Sixth, exactly what material was taken? It finishes with, because the U.S. Attorney and it seems the trial prosecutors are currently in possession of privileged materials, we request a full evidentiary hearing as soon as the court can accommodate us. And then the court made a filing note on this. The government must respond by 5 p.m. today, November 18th. The court will hold a hearing on this matter tomorrow, November 19th at 3 p.m. in courtroom 15A. Unless the parties mutually agree to a remote conference instead. The clerk of court is respectfully directed to terminate the motion at docket 70, so ordered. So this becomes motion 71. But yeah, the judge is like, get in here, talk to me, tell me what's going on. So the government did respond. November 18th, 2024, dear Judge S., the government respectfully submits this letter in connection with defendant's letter dated November 18th and in response to the court's order issued earlier today, docket 71, for the reasons that follow. The relief requested by defendant, including an evidentiary hearing, are unnecessary. Your Honor, everyone's freaking out for no reason. Well, let's hear what the government has to say, shall we? On or about September 16th, the defendant was arrested. The following day, the above referenced indictment was unsealed and the defendant was arraigned before Judge Trinovsky. As part of that proceeding, the government moved for detention under the Bail Reform Act. Finding there was no condition or combination of conditions that would assure the safety of the community, the judge denied bail. The following day, Judge Carter also denied bail. Then we get to defendant's communications. Since being ordered detained, the defendant has been held at MDC by the Bureau of Prisons, or a Bureau of Prisons facility, BOP. With respect to inmate communications, all BOP inmates, including the defendant, are afforded the opportunity to confer with attorneys on unmonitored phone lines. Other communications occur over BOP-monitored phone lines and email. As a part of the general practice to screen monitor communications for content, quote, that could jeopardize the public or the safety, security, or orderly operation of the facility, BOP staff, including a particular BOP investigator, has consistently monitored defendants' communications on monitored communication channels, including monitored phone lines. This monitoring is independent of the case team, i.e., the AUSA is charged with investigating and prosecuting the defendant, and is not done at its direction. So the jail monitors for its own purposes. The government also monitors or is given those calls in downloads for their own purposes. The government will pull the downloads of your phone if they are not just routinely provided. They may or may not be. I don't know what the U.S. Attorney's Office does as a habit of practice in 2024, but the jail monitors those things for their own purposes. It goes on to say, as set out in the government's November 15th brief and made clear on the record during previous bail hearings, the government's grand jury investigation of the defendant and the defendant's obstruction related to this criminal case is continuing. Hear that? Obstruction related to this criminal case. Obstruction charges when then? It goes on to say, as part of that investigation, the government has sent grand jury subpoenas and documents requests to the BOP for the defendant's monitored communications, including calls and emails. From those materials, the government learned that defendant has persisted in engaging in obstructive conduct since he entered BOP custody. Among other things, he's engaged in unauthorized communications via three-way calls, the use of the PAC codes, and third-party texting services. All of that is outlined in the motion that we just read. The government goes on to say it's clear to all parties involved that these calls and emails are monitored. In an abundance of caution, the government sent any potentially privileged communication, i.e., any communication involving an attorney, to the filter team for review before it was released to the case team. As is the government's longstanding practice in ongoing covert investigations, such as the investigation into defendant's obstructive conduct in MDC, the government did not disclose potentially privileged communications to defense counsel in the first instance. Okay, because it's an ongoing investigation. They say, as stated in the government's opposition to the defendant's bail motion, the government intends to produce all the defendant's calls and emails in full to the defense today. I wonder if when the government says they intend to produce them in full, that they are producing things that have gone through the filter team, or everything, and then noting what they have and what they don't have. That would be interesting to see. But if they produce everything, the defense is going to come in here and be like, well, we received these things, they're privileged. Were they filtered or not filtered? So the government's going to have to make that clear. It goes on to talk about the sweep of the MDC. In or around October 28th, the BOP and several other federal and local agencies initiated a sweep of MDC. The sweep was pre-planned and coordinated to ensure the safety and security of staff and inmates at MDC and was part of a larger safety and security initiative and was not in response to any particular threat or intelligence. See the press release about the sweep. Lawnerd, I know you are so excited about Lawnerd Shop 2.0, and some of you have seen the teaser in our app and on live stream, and it's rolling out soon. And yes, it is rolling out on Shopify. Shopify has made it so easy to completely redo our store while taking advantage of all the powerful tools that Shopify has to offer. So whether you are just starting your business or growing into a completely new phase of business, Shopify has you covered. It's no wonder that businesses that grow with Shopify, and the Lawnerd Shop is no exception. I started on Shopify building out the shop myself, and now we have an incredible team bringing us all kinds of custom merchandise created with love just for the Lawnerds. And it's really no wonder that so many businesses choose Shopify, because they have the #1 checkout on the planet, and you can use Shop Pay, which converts at 50% better. Why? Well, I would imagine it's because everything's already there, and it just makes it so easy to go, yes, please. So if you were ready to upgrade your business and have the same checkout experience that the Lawnerd Shop does, now is the time to sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/Lawnerd. Remember, it's all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/Lawnerd to upgrade your selling today. And you'll start hearing this sound soon. Let's get back to today's episode. It goes on to say the MDC sweep included the jail and the warehouses where MDC food and other property was stored. It was planned well in advance of defendant's arrest and was not conducted to target any particular inmate, including the defendant. During the MDC sweep, multiple housing units were searched, including defendant's unit. Members of the case team were aware in advance that the defendant's housing unit would be searched in addition to other areas of the jail. No one on the case team supervised, conducted, or participated in the search of any housing unit, nor the search of defendant's bunk. In fact, the case team was not aware in advance of what agents or officers were conducting the search in that housing area. Investigator 1 was assigned by BOP to participate in the week-long sweep and was present at MDC during the operation. During the sweep of defendant's housing unit, Investigator 1 interviewed multiple inmates, including defendant, about potential corruption and contraband at MDC. Right. They're targeting people that work at the jail, not the inmates. Or, given that they're sweeping the off-site kitchens, they are concerned about people working in or around the jail facility sneaking things into defendants. That's what that sounds like to me. Goes on to say, following Investigator 1's interview of defendant, Investigator 1 approached defendant's bunk to check for contraband. On the defendant's bunk, Investigator 1 found the following items: a manila folder marked legal, a notebook labeled redacted, an address book, personal effects. Investigator 1 felt the outside of the manila folder marked legal for contraband, feeling none, set it aside, and did not open or photograph it. With respect to the notebook labeled redacted and the address book, Investigator 1 took photos of those materials, left the materials in the bunk, and no materials were seized from defendant. Well, that's why the defendant didn't tell the attorneys anything was taken. Nothing was taken. It says, following the MDC sweep, Investigator 1 alerted the case team he had taken photos of defendant's notebook and address book. Investigator 1 described the redacted title notebook largely as notes to self written by defendant that included notes regarding blank. In an abundance of caution, the case team asked Investigator 1 to provide the photographs directly to the filter team, given the possibility that they touched on legal strategy. I don't know if strategizing an Instagram post is going to count, but who knows? It says, following review, the filter team provided certain of the photographs to the case team, including photographs containing redactions. Footnote 2. For reference, the government has included as exhibits photographs of the notebook labeled things to do. Did they redact the name of the notebook in the entire pleading and then not redact it in the footnote? Is it the same? Is the notebook called things to do? That's hilarious. For reference, the government is including as exhibits photographs of the notebook labeled things to do and the address book as exhibit A, which contains redactions per the filter team's review. This is a full set of material from the Bureau of Prisons sweep and was provided to the case team. The exhibit is being filed under sealed pursuant to the protective order governing discovery in this case. Boo. We don't get to see the notebook yet. Maybe later. The things to do notebook will come up. I imagine the things to do notebook is the one that was notes to self, but it's funny to me that they redacted the name of the notebook everywhere except in the footnote. You missed one. Then we're talking about this motion. On November 8th, defendant submitted a renewed motion for bail in front of Your Honor. In the government's response from November 15th, the government argued that the court should deny the defendant's motion to reopen the bail hearing since he failed to present any new material information. We just went over that. On November 18th, defense counsel submitted a letter motion to the court arguing the government was in possession of attorney-client privilege material, namely portions of the photographs which reflect the defendant's notes, which it argued were privileged notes to his lawyers concerning defense witnesses and defense strategy. The defense also argues that the government had engaged in a targeted seizure of defendant's materials. As discussed herein, there was no targeted seizure of defendant, and the BOP sweep resulting in the government's obtaining the photographs were not unconstitutional nor improper. They then go to cite the case law, talking about searches from inmates in custody, talking about potential seizures of property from inmates in custody, and the like. They talk about the use of a taint team or a filter team, which is a common procedure in their district. And then we get to the discussion where they say the fact that the photographs were taken is entirely proper. They were taken during a pre-planned sweep of MDC, which is organized, initiated, and executed by BOP staff with the assistance of multiple federal and local partners for the purpose of the safety and security of the inmates and staff and to address persistent issues that have arisen at MDC, including issues the defendant himself complains of. Given that this major law enforcement operation was planned well in advance of defendant's arrest, there can be no credible argument that the sweep itself was meant to target defendant. Indeed, no member of the case team conducted or was present during the search and only learned about photographs once the search was complete. In sum, there's no evidence to support the defendant's weak suggestion that Investigator 1's taking photos of the defendant's notes was a targeted seizure. Nor, they say, is it improper that Investigator 1 took the photographs. Investigator 1 had reviewed the defendant's cell and emails in which the defendant overtly and persistently engaged in conduct that violated BOP rules and regulations. Therefore, they are arguing it was entirely justified in inspecting the defendant's assigned bunk to recover additional evidence related to those violations and to ensure the security of the BOP facility. Moreover, Investigator 1, who is not bound by any privilege doctrine that may affect the case team, took steps to respect the potential privilege of the defendant's personal effects and did not examine the folder labeled quote unquote legal. I wonder if all the notebooks will end up in that folder from now on. What's your guess on that? He confirmed his review of materials to the notebook labeled redacted, probably things to do, Moreover, none of the steps taken by Investigator 1 while searching the defendant's bunk were done by the case team or at the case team's direction, and they were not aware until after the sweep. Second, the government's use of a filter team to review the photos in the first instance is entirely appropriate and adequately protected any potential privileged documents, as is consistent with the practice in this district. The filter team's review segregated potentially privileged materials as evidenced in the redactions contained in the photographs. This approach is eminently reasonable. Here, the photographs related to the government's ongoing covert grand jury investigation. The government had no obligation to seek defense counsel's view of the privileged determinations made by the filter team. Finally, the photographs and what is depicted in them are not privileged. And then it goes to footnote 3. The defendant appears to assert that the photographs are protected by both attorney-client and work product privileges. Work product, by the way, means the attorneys created it. So that's probably not the case here. They then go on to define the two privileges, I think illuminating that this can't be work product unless all of a sudden Combs is an attorney and representing himself. They go on to say the defendant doesn't argue, nor could he, that the notes in the photographs were prepared for the purpose of obtaining legal advice. Contrary to the defendant's counsel's mischaracterization, the photographs do not reflect, quote, notes to the defendant's lawyers concerning defense witnesses and defense strategy. Rather, the photographs depicted in the defendant's wide-ranging notes to himself include notes related to the defendant's business interests, his release of music, family matters, among other things. They say even if there was a disclosure of privileged material to the case team, that alone is not a basis for the relief the defendant seeks. Indeed, in order to be entitled to a hearing to determine whether the prosecution was tainted by exposure to privileged information, defendants have the burden of showing a factual relationship between privileged information and the prosecution. They say the defendant has not done so here, particularly given the government's good faith use of a filter team. And then they ask that the court deny an evidentiary hearing because it's not required nor is it appropriate under law. And then they filed all the exhibits under seal. So let's summarize, shall we? The government has an ongoing investigation into Sean Combs. They are big mad about his what they call obstructive behavior, the fact that he is trying to get around the government monitoring of his phone calls and emails, and that he is orchestrating social media posts from behind bars to, as they argue, taint the jury pool. It's a big assertion to make, but there's a lot redacted out of that. So I would anticipate the government would back those statements up with the direct statements of defendant in those redacted portions. And again, the defense is saying, no, they seized all this information. Well, it seems they didn't actually seize anything. They did take pictures. It was filtered through the filter team. And given the ongoing investigation and given the end routes the defendant has made to talk to potential witnesses or actual witnesses in this case, I am not surprised that things were photographed. So what happens now? Well, the defendant pulls everyone in for a hearing. If there's an update on a hearing, we will put that in the description down below. And the litigation in this case is not going to slow down. This bail hearing is set again for right before Thanksgiving. I don't think there's any way defendant's getting out of custody based on everything we've seen here today. Do you? Do you think defendant is in a better position today to get out of custody or a worse position today to get out of custody than he was the day he was arrested? Yeah, I also think he's in a worse position today to argue for getting out of custody. And then I think what we will see is that being denied at the November 22nd hearing and the defendant trying to reinitiate his appeal that is currently on pause with regard to him being granted or denied bond. So with all of that, hopefully we will be back to non-Diddy things in the near future, and hopefully I'll be back to feeling better because I'm tired of not feeling well. I'm just not loving it. So with that, Law Nerd, thank you for being here. Thank you for being a Law Nerd. And, as we narrow down the end of the year here and get ready to shift into a entirely Monday show, we're going to have to decide, do we bring the outro for the Wednesday show over to Monday? Or do we say goodbye after 4 years? I don't know. You let me know. May your Wi-Fi be strong. May your toilet paper be plentiful. May your family be well. And may the odds be ever in your favor. I will talk to you in the next one. Bye. You can stay up to date with everything I'm covering on our free iOS and Android app at lawnerdapp.com. or search your app store for Law Nerd. And you can also follow me on social media at the Emily D. Baker. Remember, I stream on YouTube on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I recap all of that for you in quick bits on Monday. And of course, the Emily Show drops on Wednesdays. Thanks for being a Law Nerd.